I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this. My life was simple, predictable even, and I liked it that way. Then one evening, everything changed. It started with a sound that I couldn't ignore. Something told me to check, to find out what was happening. I wish I hadn't. You see, I always believed my family was solid. We had our quirks, our challenges, but we were a team. And my stepson, well, he was part of that team. He came into my life when he was still young, still figuring out the world, and I always thought I'd done my part to help him grow into a good man. But that night, that moment, it made me question everything I thought I knew about him, about myself, about us. Welcome to Sly Infidelity Stories, where secrets, passion, and forbidden desires come alive. This is your ultimate destination for thrilling tales of love, betrayal, and seduction that you won't find anywhere else. If you love stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your fellow story lovers. Your support keeps these tales coming. I met his father when I was in my 30s. He was everything I'd been searching for: steady, kind, dependable. He had a son from his first marriage, a boy who was quiet and a little shy. When we got married, I tried my best to make the boy feel at home, to let him know he had a place in our new family. Over the years, we built a bond. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. He called me by my name at first, then Mom, and I'll admit I was proud of that. We shared family dinners, holidays, even the tough moments that come with raising a teenager. I thought we had an understanding, a trust. But now I wonder if I missed something, if there were signs I should have noticed, signals I should have caught. Looking back, there were moments that didn't quite add up. Times he seemed distracted or avoided eye contact. I told myself it was normal teenage behavior. We all have our secrets, right? That night, I was alone in the house. My husband was working late, and the quietness of the evening was comforting. I was catching up on some reading when I heard it. At first, I couldn't place it, a muffled sound coming from upstairs. I paused, listening, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind outside. Maybe a creak in the floorboards. But then I heard it again. A soft, low laugh, followed by a voice. A voice I recognized. His voice. My stepson wasn't supposed to be home. At least, I didn't think he was. I put my book down, stood up, and felt the kind of unease that's hard to describe. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like a nagging pull to get up and see what was going on. So, I walked toward the stairs, my heart picking up speed with each step. My stepson's name is Alex. He came into my life when he was just 12 years old. At that age, he was quiet and a little reserved, the kind of kid who'd rather sit in his room reading comic books than play outside with other kids. I remember thinking how sweet he seemed, so different from the rambunctious boys I grew up with. When I married his dad, Tom, I knew it wasn't just about building a life with my husband. It was about creating a family. I worked hard to make Alex feel like he belonged. I'd help him with his homework, bake his favorite cookies, and always remind him he was an important part of our lives. By the time Alex turned 18, he had grown into a confident young man. He was tall, with dark hair that always fell into his eyes, and a sharp wit that sometimes caught me off guard. I noticed how people seemed drawn to him, especially girls. They'd giggle when he walked by, and I'd tease him about it. He'd just roll his eyes and laugh it off. Still, there were moments that felt different. He'd watch me sometimes, not in a creepy way, but in a way that made me feel like he was trying to figure something out. I brushed it off as curiosity or maybe admiration. After all, I was the only mother figure he'd known for the past 6 years. He was polite, always saying thank you and helping around the house. Yet there were times when his politeness felt too perfect, like he was keeping something just beneath the surface. I told myself it was normal teenage stuff. Boys his age had secrets. They liked their privacy. I didn't push. Around the time Alex graduated high school, I started noticing small changes in him. He wasn't home as much. He'd leave early in the morning and come back late at night, sometimes with a smirk on his face that made me wonder what he'd been up to. When I asked, he'd shrug and say, "Just hanging out with friends." I didn't want to pry. He was 18, practically an adult. But there were other things, too. His phone, which he used to leave lying around, was now always in his pocket or face down on the table. He'd step out of the room to take calls, and when he came back, he'd avoid meeting my eyes. Then there was the confidence. Alex had always been self-assured, but now it was different. It was like he knew something the rest of us didn't. He carried himself with an air of mystery, and while most people might have seen it as charm, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One night, I caught him sneaking back into the house. It was past midnight, and when I asked where he'd been, he just smiled and said, "Out." His tone was light, almost teasing, but his eyes dared me to ask more. I didn't. There were little things, too, like how he'd pause when I walked into the room, his gaze lingering a second too long before he looked away. Or how he'd suddenly get quiet when I mentioned his father. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, but it made me uneasy. Looking back, I realized the signs were there all along. The late nights, the guarded behavior, the way he'd sometimes act like he knew a secret I didn't. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. I didn't want to believe there could be more to it. If I'd paid closer attention, maybe I would have seen what was coming. Maybe I could have stopped it before it happened. But the truth is, I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to believe that the boy I'd raised could be capable of something that would shake our family to its core. That night, as I climbed the stairs toward his room, I had no idea what I was about to walk into. I had no idea how much my world was about to change. It was a Friday evening. I remember because Tom had left for a business trip earlier that morning, and I had the house to myself for the first time in weeks. I'd planned a quiet night, some tea, a good book, maybe a long bath before bed. The house was so still that I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I was curled up on the couch, lost in a mystery novel, when I thought I heard something. At first, it was faint, like the murmur of a television in another room. I paused, listening, but the sound stopped. I shrugged it off and went back to reading. A few minutes later, I heard it again, soft voices, too low to make out the words. I frowned, my eyes drifting toward the staircase. I knew Caleb had gone out with friends earlier, and he hadn't mentioned coming back. Maybe he forgot something, I thought to myself, but there was something about the sound that made me uneasy. I set my book down and stood up, my bare feet silent against the wooden floor. The house felt colder all of a sudden, the kind of chill that makes you pull your sweater tighter around you. As I climbed the stairs, the voices grew clearer, not loud, but close enough that I could tell they were coming from Caleb's room. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, my hand resting on the banister. My mind raced with possibilities. Was he on the phone? Maybe he was watching something on his laptop. I told myself there was no reason to feel uneasy, but my heart was already pounding in my chest. The hallway stretched out in front of me, the dim light from the overhead bulb casting long shadows on the walls. I walked slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The sound of my breathing seemed too loud in the quiet of the house. When I reached his door, I paused, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I don't know what I was expecting when I opened the door, but it wasn't this. The room was dimly lit by the glow of a small desk lamp in the corner. Caleb was there, sitting on the edge of his bed, his back to me. He wasn't alone. There was someone with him, a girl I didn't recognize. They both froze the moment they noticed me. Caleb turned his head sharply, his eyes wide with shock. The girl, she looked just as startled, her face flushed as she pulled the blanket up to cover herself. "Mom." Caleb's voice cracked as he stood up, his hands raised slightly as if to shield her from view. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the floor, and my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. My stepson, the boy I'd helped raise, the boy I thought I knew, was standing in front of me, caught in a moment I wasn't supposed to see. What is going on here?" I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. Caleb opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The girl glanced between us, clearly panicked, before she grabbed her clothes from the floor and bolted toward the bathroom. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving Caleb and me alone in the room. The silence that followed was unbearable. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat, the rush of blood in my ears. Caleb's face was pale, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Mom, I can explain," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, trying to pull myself together. "Explain what, Caleb? What could you possibly say right now that would make this okay?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it fear? Anger? Shame? Maybe it was all of those things. I didn't know, and at that moment, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I took a step back, the weight of the situation pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. "We'll talk about this later," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Right now, I need to think." Caleb didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me as if he wanted to say something, but didn't know how. Finally, I turned and walked out of the room, closing the door behind me. As I stood in the hallway, my hands shaking, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. Whatever innocence had existed between us was gone now, replaced by something I didn't fully understand. And the look in his eyes, fear, defiance, something else I couldn't name, it stayed with me, haunting me as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Tom would be back in a few days, and I had no idea what I was going to tell him, if I was going to tell him. The next morning, I made breakfast like I always did. Pancakes, eggs, and bacon, the usual. Caleb came downstairs late, his footsteps hesitant on the stairs. When he walked into the kitchen, he didn't look at me. He just mumbled a quiet morning and sat down at the table. I watched him from the corner of my eye as I flipped the pancakes. He looked nervous, like he was waiting for me to say something. The silence between us was thick, heavy with everything that had happened the night before. Finally, I set a plate in front of him and sat down across the table. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "We need to talk, Caleb," I said. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and uncertain. "About last night," I continued. "I need to understand what's going on." For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he said quietly. "I didn't want you to find out that way." "Find out what?" I asked, my voice softer now. He hesitated, then looked down at his plate. "I've been seeing her for a few months," he admitted. "I didn't tell you or Dad because I thought you'd disapprove." I frowned, trying to process his words. "Caleb, it's not about whether I approve or not. It's about being honest. Sneaking around, hiding things, it's not the way to handle this." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to mess things up. You and Dad have always been so good to me, and I didn't want to disappoint you." His words hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so much time worrying about what I'd seen, what it meant, that I hadn't stopped to think about how he might be feeling. "I'm not angry, Caleb," I said, leaning forward. "I just wish you'd talk to me. You don't have to hide things from us." "From me?" He looked up then, his eyes filled with guilt. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." After our conversation, I spent the rest of the day cleaning the house. It's what I always do when I need to think. As I scrubbed the counters and folded laundry, I kept replaying our talk in my head. Had I been too hard on him? Too soft? Was it my fault for not noticing the signs sooner? Maybe I'd been so focused on keeping the family together, on being a good stepmother, that I'd missed what was happening right in front of me. I thought about all the times Caleb had come to me with questions, all the moments I'd brushed off as teenage awkwardness. Maybe if I'd paid more attention, things would have been different. But then again, maybe this was just part of growing up. Caleb was 19 after all. He was figuring out who he was, making mistakes, learning lessons. It wasn't my job to shield him from that. It was my job to guide him through it. Still, the memory of that night lingered in my mind. The look in his eyes, the fear and defiance, the way he'd stood there like a child caught doing something he shouldn't. It made my heart ache in a way I couldn't quite explain. In the days that followed, things slowly started to go back to normal, or at least as normal as they could be. Caleb was more careful around the house, more respectful of the boundaries we talked about. He even started opening up to me more, asking for advice about school, his friends, and once or twice about the girl he'd been seeing. We agreed not to tell Tom about what had happened. Caleb said he wasn't ready, and I didn't want to push him. It felt like a fragile truce, one that could break if we weren't careful. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us. There was a distance now, a barrier that hadn't been there before. I missed the easy conversations, the shared laughter, the sense of trust we'd built over the years. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Caleb turned to me and said, "Thanks for understanding, Mom." I looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "You're my family, Caleb," I said. "No matter what, that's never going to change." He nodded, a small smile on his lips. It was a moment of peace, a sign that maybe, just maybe, we'd be okay. But even now, I can't help wondering if things will ever truly go back to the way they were. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen. And some moments, no matter how much you try to forget, stay with you forever. In the weeks that followed, I thought a lot about what had happened. Every time I walked past Caleb's room or sat across from him at dinner, I'd find myself replaying that night in my mind. The shock, the confusion, the look on his face, it was like a movie stuck on repeat. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something important. This wasn't just about Caleb. It was about me, too. It was about the way I reacted, the way I listened or didn't listen, and the way I handled the trust we had between us. I'd always prided myself on being a good stepmom. When Tom and I got married, I promised myself I'd treat Caleb like my own son. And for the most part, I thought I had. But this situation made me see things differently. I learned that being a parent, step or not, isn't just about rules or discipline. It's about understanding, about listening, about meeting your child where they are, not where you want them to be. Caleb didn't need me to judge him or punish him. He needed me to hear him, to help him navigate the messiness of growing up. And I realized something else, too. I'd been so focused on keeping things perfect, the perfect family, the perfect home, that I'd forgotten how important it is to be real. Real families have problems. Real families have awkward, uncomfortable moments. And that's okay. What matters is how we move through those moments together. Sometimes, life throws us into situations we'd rather avoid. Situations that make us uncomfortable, that force us to look at ourselves and the people we love in ways we never expected. Maybe you've been there, too. Maybe you've found yourself in a moment where everything you thought you knew suddenly felt uncertain. Maybe you've had to face a truth you weren't ready for. It's not easy. Trust me, I know. But here's what I've learned. Those moments, as hard as they are, can teach us something. They can make us stronger, more understanding, more compassionate. When I look at Caleb now, I don't just see my stepson. I see a young man trying to figure out who he is. I see someone who's going to make mistakes, just like I did at his age. And I see someone who, no matter what, deserves to feel loved and supported. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this story, it's this. Communication matters. Boundaries matter. Forgiveness matters. And above all, love matters. So, if you're ever in a situation like mine, if you find yourself facing something unexpected, something you don't know how to handle, take a deep breath. Step back. And remember that it's okay not to have all the answers. What matters is that you try, that you show up, that you care. And if you're watching this and thinking about your own family, I encourage you to take a moment to check in. Ask the questions you've been afraid to ask. Say the things you've been holding back. You might be surprised at what you learn. As for me and Caleb, we're still figuring things out. We're not perfect, but we're trying. And in the end, that's all any of us can do, isn't it? Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it's given you something to think about, something to take with you. And if you have your own experiences to share, moments where life threw you a curveball, I'd love to hear them. Leave a comment below, and let's start a conversation. As I sat down to tell you this story, I didn't know how it would end. I didn't know if it would bring me peace or just open old wounds. But what I do know is that sharing it has helped me see things more clearly. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where your world flipped upside down? Where something unexpected made you question everything you thought you knew? Maybe it was with family, friends, or even yourself. Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you handled it, or even how you didn't. Sometimes just talking about it makes all the difference. And if you think this story was intense, wait until you hear what's coming next. Next time, I'll be sharing a story about the secrets we keep to protect the ones we love, secrets that can heal us or break us apart. Trust me, it's a story you won't want to miss. Before you go, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. Stories like these aren't always easy to share, but knowing there's someone out there who might find comfort or understanding in my words makes it all worth it. If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel something, please hit the like button. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories that explore the messy, beautiful, and complicated parts of life. And one last thing, if you know someone who might relate to this story, share it with them. Sometimes, hearing someone else's experience is all it takes to feel a little less alone. Thank you again for being here. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other. I'll see you in the next story.